One.
Welcome to the Daily Objective, day 97 of the war in Israel. I'm joined by James Valliant again. James, how are you doing?
I'm hanging in there,
Yeah,
despite despite what I really feel it's a crumbling effort on the part of the fight against Hamas, and I'm seeing it more and more every day. So I don't mean to sound depressed. I don't mean to sound like I'm increasingly depressed as time goes on, but I think there's reason for it.
yeah,
But I'm
yeah.
doing
And
okay.
and and today is a particularly depressing day. We're going to talk about it on the reality show. James, we're going to talk about it with you as well tomorrow. You are a former prosecutor, so you have, the legal expertise to talk about that. Although I don't know if it's quite the same because you dealt with actual law, not fake law. But anyway,
Right.
so we are talking about the Palestinian people, the civilians today, and how they are responsible for October 7th. Now, there's several things to be said here, some of which we've we've said about Palestinian society before, but I think we need to kind of focus in on a few points. But just generally speaking, first, the images that we've seen of Palestinians celebrating, of Palestinians participating when as soon as they heard that there's a that the fence had been breached, going into Israel, committing whatever atrocities they could have, on the fly without actually planning it, like Hamas, the commando force did. So this is something that everybody pretty much in Gaza was happy to be involved in. So James, your general thoughts on this before we look at some specific examples.
Well, first, I think there are a couple of general points that need to be made. These organizations, and there's a variety of organizations and factions among the so-called Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank, and sometimes we make in the West, the Western media makes a great deal of difference between these factions, when in fact, in certain fundamentals, all of these factions basically agree that Israel should be wiped out. None of them have yet truly acknowledged the right of Israel to exist. And I'm including in this the Palestinian Authority and Mr. Abbas, who you will recall in the wake of October 7th was minimizing this, saying is blaming the IDF and Israel for setting this up as an excuse to attack Hamas. So that's the kind of lies that come from the so-called moderates in this. Furthermore, without a widespread popular support, none of these organizations could pull off the violent terrorism that they do. I mean, honestly, there has to be material support. There have to be people behind the scenes. If you think that it was just the people who went in and invaded that those poor people at the concert, or these peaceful kibbutzes, and you're right, many took advantage and came in. If you think the people who did the actual invading were the only people behind this, you're very naive. There had to be people in Gaza who were giving them material support, moral support, organizational support. So what we're looking at in terms of the actual invaders are simply the tip of the iceberg. And they had to have a large infrastructure and moral support and organizational support among the population that makes this possible. Another thing that I think we need to bear in mind is that unlike, say, Germany during World War II, there is no large-scale active resistance among the so-called Palestinian people against this. There are people out there protesting, risking their lives to bring down Hamas or bring down, the Muslim Brotherhood or something. And in the Western media, for decades, there's been an active attempt to minimize the moral fault of the Palestinian, so again, I'm going to keep using that word, so-called Palestinian people. For example, Donald Trump a few years ago, he said, I remember seeing videos of Palestinians celebrating in the streets after 9/11. He was called on that by the liberal media. The liberal media in my country, the United States, said, oh, Mr. Trump, the Palestinians weren't out there celebrating in the wake of 9/11. In fact, they were. Further reports showed Palestinians indeed actively tried to suppress the tapes of their celebrating, but they were handing out candy. They were handing out cake. They were celebrating and partying in the streets, thousands upon thousands of them in the wake of 9/11. This has been going on for a long time. We've talked about before on this show about those poor Israelis that accidentally wandered into so-called Palestinian territory and were basically lynched by an angry mob. And that kind of gives you, these kind of stories give you a sense of it. And also, well, one more thing. You know, back 17 years ago, when there were elections for the control of Gaza, we were told only some 40 some percent of the voters voted for Hamas. Another smaller, but some 40 some percent voted for the moderate party, Fatah, the Palestinian Authority people. What about those other people? In between. Those groups are complete. That there remains about 20% there. You see, we don't hear about, nor do we hear about opinions even within those groups, and nor are we taught the actual opinion of someone like Fatah, who were making excuses for Hamas in the wake of October 7th. So
Yeah.
you were told, for example, that half the population of so-called Palestinians are children, as if that makes any kind of difference. In fact, there is far more widespread popular support for the anti-Semitic violence, murderous, genocidal violence against Israel openly than there was support for the Nazis among the Germans during World War II.
Yeah. Now back to the election. Yeah, a vote for Fatah is a vote for from the river to the sea. So
Yeah.
it's and not necessarily by different means. It's mostly with a different end. A more of a nationalistic kind of fascist regime as opposed to an Islamic theocracy. So that's the different. A couple of
Slight
points you
differences in
made.
form, slight differences in form and approach.
Yeah.
You know, I have to say, just really, that's all it is.
Yeah.
Um,
A couple of things you said. So first of all, you said the media makes the distinction between Hamas and the Palestinian people. So does Israel, unfortunately, and that's where Israel is really losing that war because it makes that distinction, it acts on that distinction, and it sacrifices the lives of its own soldiers and the security of its own citizens to for that distinction. So yeah, this is a mistake that is everybody is guilty of, unfortunately. And yeah, you said unlike Germany, there's no active resistance. It's much more than that. So I'm going to get to a couple of the stories of hostages actually who was holding the hostages, but just the fact that 240 hostages were being held in Gaza in different places. The fact that they are held and nobody does anything about that, that tells you the people have to be involved. The people are not rising up. The people are not saying, "Look, these are civilians for the most part. We can't do this. This is not what decent human beings do." They don't care. They don't want to
where
be decent
are
human
the
beings.
Oscar Schindlers? Where are the Oscar Schindlers among the so-called Palestinian people saying, no, this is wrong. I don't like what my people are doing. I'm going to help the hostages. I'm going to oppose these terrorist attacks. If I can just quote from a famous, and I think this was the best, there have been multiple surveys done of the Palestinian people on the West Bank and Gaza, but one that was done at the end of October or beginning of November, a recent poll by Birzeit University, and I think they're the best because they break it down the best. The Arab World Research and Development Center for that university showed a strong Palestinian support for Hamas in the October 7th attack against Israel. In the West Bank, 83.1% of Palestinian respondents supported the attack, while in Gaza the figure was 63.6. And while you think that might be better, a full 14% in Gaza were neutral. So you can imagine being neutral. Maybe this isn't the time. Maybe we should have done it worse. That's what we mean by neutral, right? Imagine being neutral about October 7th. So when we add that in, that's well over 3/4 of the people on the West Bank or Gaza who were either supporting, or actively supporting, or neutral. There's no difference between men and women, about 75.2 versus 74.9. The respondents strongly showed support for the military wings, and this is what's interesting, the various military wings of the various terrorist groups. Palestinian Islamic Jihad has 84% support. The Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade has some 80% popular support, and the Al-Qassam brigades have some 89 support, with Hamas with an overall rating of just 76%. So let me just point out that these other radical groups have even stronger popular support among Palestinians than Hamas does. Stronger support than Hamas does. So when you see Hamas over here and Palestinian Authority over here, it doesn't break down the actual opinion um, that's going on here, and I think that's very important to bear in mind. Uh, and finally, the thing I'd say is that the percentage of people who are children is utterly irrelevant. The idea that the children are going to be any different than their parents on this is, highly unrealistic. And it really doesn't matter the individual moral status, as I've stressed over and over. Some might be, developmentally disabled and can't even know any better. Some may have some exposure to the West and can and should and must know better. But such differences don't matter to me in the slightest. If you are motivated by this act of belief, in this hatred for Israel and this desire for Israel to be utterly destroyed, because that clearly enjoys the huge support of the so-called Palestinian people. I don't care what your moral status is. You are an active murderous threat to Israel and civilization, and you have no right to live right now. You should be killed, and you are the problem. In fact, you're the infrastructure and the moral support for the problem. That is why you are a valid target in this war. And questions of their individual innocence are really irrelevant when, in fact, they are murderous threats to Israel.
So you mentioned this poll, and we've talked about this poll a lot, where 75% of Palestinians in the West Bank said they supported October 7th, and I don't remember what the figure was, but 60 something in Gaza. And every time you mention this poll, I repeat, and I will keep repeating every time you mention it, the people who didn't say, yes, I support October 7th, did not necessarily say, no, I oppose such actions. I don't think we should kill the Jews. They didn't like October 7th for whatever reason. It could have been opposition to terrorism in general. I kind of doubt that's
Maybe it
a
wasn't
big chunk of
enough.
the
Maybe
people.
they wanted more. Maybe
Yeah,
they wanted it to be 10 times stronger.
yeah,
Or
yeah.
it was just a
So
question of timing. Or
yeah,
maybe it just wasn't the right time and we could have done it earlier or later.
yeah, and
That doesn't mean they opposed violence against Jews.
yeah, and I think if people were asked that and answered honestly, we would see a much higher percentage. Thank you, Phil, for the super chat. Phil says all individuals have power over only two things, what they say and what they do. Thank you, Jonathan, for the super chat. Thank you, Jim, for the super chat. And thank you, Smani, for becoming a member of our YouTube channel. There are many perks of memberships on different levels. There are perks of membership on YouTube as well, including access to live streams of James, your Sunday sessions on um, Peacock's courses. And I think we're going to do maybe a special member session sometime soon, reading some of the less nice comments we've had. I don't want to feed the trolls publicly, but we might do that for members in the next week or so. Yeah, all right. I want to get to this. So this was from when is it? It's November 29th. There was a tweet by Israeli journalist Almog Boker. So he wrote this story, I believe, at the time, but and I'm kind of translating in my mind because it's in Hebrew. But he was talking about how one of the hostages was held for nearly 50 days in the attic of a UNRWA teacher. We have talked a lot about UNRWA, and they will be mentioned again and again on this channel. And this is a father of 10 children who locked up the hostage in the attic, barely gave him any food, didn't give him medicine.
Okay, I'm
And
about ready to come out of my skin right now. I'm sorry to interrupt,
well,
but
there's
we
one
have
more though.
UNRWA employee actively helping hostage taking. He is a terrorist. An
Yes,
UNRWA employee is part of October 7th. The
yes.
United Nations is paying money to one of the monsters of October 7th. Think about that, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry to blow up like that, but I want you to think about that for a second. United Nations money that comes from the United Kingdom and the United States pays this individual who is actively keeping one of the October 7th hostages in their attic. The United Nations is complicit in October 7th. Full stop.
So in another case, a hostage was held by a doctor in Gaza, a doctor who was still working, was treating the wounded among the Palestinians, but was holding. So this is when you're told that the story about Palestinian civilians and how they're suffering, and of course anybody who was able to stomach any of the South African rant in the International Criminal, I forget the acronym, but the court today, which we are going to talk about in the reality show in 14 minutes. Yeah, it's you know, when they talk about civilians, those are the Palestinian civilians. Those are the Palestinian people. The Palestinian people were united on October 7th. They're united now. They don't like the fact that the Jews are defending themselves, but their goal is clear and has always been clear. Always since the Palestinian people you know, declared themselves Palestinian or started calling themselves that, um, that has always been the case.
Yes.
James.
Well, all I can say is yes. It's just, you know, and as I say, in the 21st century, it is impossible for their leaders, for their ideological leaders, to be morally innocent. It is simply impossible. We have the son of the Hamas founder who knew better. And as I say, as you go down through individual, you know, moral evaluations of individual Palestinians, it really is irrelevant. It really is irrelevant whether they're children, brainwashed, have a gun to their head. They're part of the Palestinian war machine. But the fact is, they don't have enough guns to put to these people's heads. They don't have the technology or the infrastructure of totalitarian suppression, say that the Soviet Union had or that Nazi Germany had. They couldn't suppress these people. This is the uprising of the true feelings of the vast majority of the Palestinian people. It has to be. Otherwise, you wouldn't get the breakdown between all the various different radical groups and their support to the tune of some 80, 90% of the populations. These Hamas is not, you know, people say end the occupation of Gaza by Hamas. Well, I agree. It is a brutal occupation for anyone there who might individually be innocent. But I have to believe that Hamas and or groups worse or just as bad are supported and in power because the large majority of the populations there willingly want that is their voice. These are their representatives. This is what they want, or something worse, or something worse. The Palestinian people, the civilians themselves, are supporting this horror in a way that even the German people, to the degree that the German people did not even support Nazis, much more support even than we can even detect that the Soviets had among their people, although early on the communists may have enjoyed popular support. But even there, Palestinians support these monsters
Yeah. And
far greater numbers than those totalitarians had support.
And the degree of support, and we've spoken about this as well, the degree of support doesn't actually matter. I mean, it didn't matter in Germany how many people stood up to the Nazis. Britain,
Right.
nobody in Britain said, look, we can't bomb them. We have to send them food and medicine. We have to send them fuel because you know, the people aren't you know, aren't involved there. It's not their fault. It's just the Nazis. No, Germany was the enemy. The war was against Germany. Japan was the enemy. The war was against Japan. They got what they deserved, and here we are talking about how we should treat the enemy as if they are our victims. So I want to read a couple of super chats. Thank you, Gigi Ryder, who says Netanyahu said Israel would fight peace, quote, to the last drop of blood of Palestinian children. Whoops, typo, wrong. That statement from Akel, the Palestinian ambassador to Iraq. I don't know if I read that name correctly, but who cares?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Who's
Thank you
got
for
the genocidal motives? The explicitly genocidal motives. And then look at the behavior on October 7th and the call for war. Yeah. Yeah. The genocide is on one side here. The intentional genocide is being, at least the intention to do genocide, is all on one side here. Yeah.
Thank you, Bonnie, for the super chat. Thank you, Ashley Shrugged. Ashley says, US, Israel, UK need to leave UN immediately. I absolutely agree. And of course, we've been advocating for that on this channel long before October 7th. And I don't think it's coming anytime soon, but we will keep demanding it until it happens. Thank you, Alec, for the super chat and for opening up a can of worms with this question. Please elaborate on the anti-Semitism baked into early and medieval Christianity. That is a question for you, James.
Oh, well, yeah. I believe that Christianity was a reaction to Jewish nationalism in the first and second centuries. You know, the wars between the Romans and the Jews that reduced the Second Temple to the Wailing Wall it is today. That violent conflict between Jews and Romans 2,000 years ago is what caused Christianity. And part of Christianity has baked into the cake anti-Semitism. For example, the story of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection is really a political piece of fiction designed to exonerate the Romans for a Roman execution and collectively blame the Jews. So for the last 2,000 years, they've made up all kinds of other, blood libel and other horrific anti-Semitic stories, but it all begins in the Gospels and it goes all the way back to the origins of Christianity. And I would further note that the origins of Islam are similar. It's similar. There was a disgust and a disdain for the fact that the Jews were not as radical, as intense, as religiously devoted to, for example, an opposition to idol worship or their monotheistic beliefs. And so Jews have been hated from the outset, both in the literature of Christianity and Islam from the outset. But now, obviously, not all Christians are anti-Semitic today. Christianity went through an enlightenment. Unfortunately, Islam has not. And so their initial baked into the cake anti-Semitism of Islam has only reached a new ugly flowering today.
Now, James, there's only so much you can elaborate on a short show, but if people want to know more from you about the origins of Christianity, is there a way they can find out?
They sure can. They can go to www.creatingchrist.com, the website based on my recent book with Warren Fay, Creating Christ, How Roman Emperors Invented Christianity. It's doing very well. And there's a documentary available on YouTube and Amazon.com based upon it.
Thanks. Thank you, Wes, for the super chat as well. So, James, you mentioned the lynch in Ramallah. That's also something that people should be reminded of, and people might not remember because they might be too young to remember it, but look up the lynch in Ramallah. This was in 2000. Two Israeli reserve soldiers accidentally took a turn into Ramallah, and the Palestinian people did what the Palestinian people do, which is slaughtered them. So they were arrested, they were held in a in the police station, and the people heard that there are Jews.
Mob,
Yeah,
a
the people
mob,
heard that there are Jews in the police
mob.
station. The people came. The people lynched those two soldiers to death. There's some footage of that you can find online if you.
The hooting and hollering and celebrating of these people as they're lynching these poor innocent Israelis who wander in. Now, can you imagine the other way around happening? If Palestinians, even people who might be associated with one of these terrorist organizations, just happened to wander in, did nothing violent, did nothing threatening, and just accidentally wandered in, do you think a Jewish mob would attack them, beat them, and jeer as they're hanging them in public? No, I don't think so.
Yeah, and by the way, at the time, Israel's response was to call up the Palestinians, tell them to evacuate the police station so that they can bomb an empty building. And then the Clinton administration condemned the lynch and condemned Israel's bombing of an empty building. Um, yeah, and much of what we hear now, it very much nothing has changed. Much of what we hear now about the devastation in Gaza is the fact that buildings are being taken down, and those buildings, of course, have to be taken down to at least try to minimize casualties on Israel's side, because when the buildings are still standing, terrorists are usually there waiting to kill Jews. So
they get the warning, they get to leave the building. So the thought, knowing in there, the building is blown up. If it isn't blown up somehow, or if there's some part of it, they'll come right back in, or, and reuse it. I mean, talk about, I cannot, and the very idea that Israel is going overboard or being too aggressive or being too indiscriminate is just bizarre and upside down. I have never heard of a more surgical, more careful, in fact, more ridiculously walking on eggshells sort of attack. Israel is showing more concern for civilians than I've ever seen done in any act of war in human history. And I can say that as a historian, and certainly nothing like what they need to be doing here. Their arms are tied behind their back. simply because the Palestinians are so successfully using Western morality against itself. It is we are morally disarmed in Israel and the United States by this evil philosophy, and the so-called Palestinians are that is their explicit strategy is to disarm the West from a forceful reaction by means of our own altruistic suicidal doctrines.
So we have a couple of minutes left. I want to address something that's said in the chat. Arlo says, "Not all. One lady blames Hamas, calling them pigs, and they covered her mouth not to harm her, but for her safety." Yeah. So this is a good point. We've seen some
Yeah.
of those videos. We've seen videos of people, where somebody on Al Jazeera talking about Hamas, and immediately the reporter takes away the microphone. Of course, there are people who realize what the problem is, and again, people have free will. So, of course, there would be individuals in every society who oppose the essence of that society. And I don't think there are many of them among the Palestinians, but they do exist. But let's remember that the context, which is the context of war, this is not an issue that can be taken into account if you want to win the war. So if Israel is now going to say, look, there's that woman and there's that guy who was on Al Jazeera and they cut him off, and so Israel, what should go house by house, ask people if they're terrorists before taking any action. This guarantees the loss of this, and this guarantees Hamas achieving its goal of doing October 7th again and again until there are no more Jews left to kill.
The
So
existence of these examples and the example of that woman who was shut up because she was complaining that her own child was dead tells you that they have free will, that they could know better. Those individuals, I think, are a very, very small minority. And you look at the extreme situation this woman was in, her own child had died. And she lets out accidentally a complaint about Hamas. And of course, she's shut up. But of course, you couldn't get away with shutting up these few people who open their mouths if you didn't have the majority of the people around supporting it. Where are the large groups taking out Hamas if they're being silenced in large numbers? But on the other hand, the fact that you got that mother who was silenced or that guy who was cut off on Al Jazeera does tell you these people do have a degree of moral responsibility. There are individuals out there who could know better and who could see what's going on in front of their face and make their own judgments. So don't let them off the moral hook either. Those examples actually show that the most Palestinian, so-called Palestinians are morally culpable to some degree. I grant you to various degrees, and I grant you there are some that must be innocent, but that is irrelevant. The individual status is irrelevant. They've been harnessed and made part of this Hamas war machine. And even if they're a 5-year-old child with a gun in their hand, they are a valid target. They are a valid target.
Um, James, I'm very proud of the content we have here, generally, but of course on the war. So if you also see value in this content and you think others should tune in as well, I encourage you to like, share, subscribe if you're not subscribed, comment below. That helps with the algorithm. And in about a minute, we have the reality show where we will talk about South Africa. James, we will also talk about South Africa tomorrow. Yeah, so stay tuned for that. Thank you, James. Thanks everybody for watching, and we'll see you in a minute.
Be safe.